The last real dinner I cooked for my husband, Howard Drummond, happened on a Wednesday in October. And I remember it the way you remember certain moments only after they've already changed you. Not while they're happening, but afterward, when you're lying alone in an unfamiliar bed, wondering how you didn't see it sooner. Spencer and his wife Celeste had driven up from Toronto for the long weekend. I'd spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen, beef stew, buttermilk biscuits, apple crumble, the kind of meal that takes hours and fills a house with warmth long before anyone sits down. Howard was in the living room watching the news. He didn't come in to ask if I needed help. He never did. Dinner started the way dinners usually started in our house. Politely, carefully. Spencer talked about the housing market in Toronto, about how impossible it had all become. Howard shook his head and said what he always said about the younger generation. Celeste ate quietly and smiled at the right moments. I refilled glasses and passed the biscuits and pretended not to notice that Howard was already on his third glass of wine. It was when Spencer mentioned groceries, how much a simple shop costs now, that Howard laughed. Not a warm laugh, the other kind. Good thing one of us has always been sensible with money, he said, setting down his wine glass with the deliberate care of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He nodded toward me without quite looking at me. Your mother would have given it all away. Spencer smiled vaguely into his stew. Celeste checked her phone. I said nothing. I had learned to say nothing. But Howard wasn't finished. He rarely was after the third glass. He leaned back in his chair. That particular lean, the one that meant he'd decided the room belonged entirely to him, and continued. She hasn't worked in 30 years, Spencer. Not a real job. She wouldn't last 60 days out there on her own. That's just the honest truth of it. The room went very quiet, not the comfortable kind. I looked at my son, the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, who cried in my arms when his first dog died, who I sat up with through 4 nights of pneumonia when he was 9 years old. I looked at him and waited. He rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing. Celeste cleared her throat. The economy's rough on everyone. Howard pointed his fork loosely in my direction. Cecily's never had to think about that. I've handled everything. She's had a comfortable life. I set my fork down very slowly. Something in my chest had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the usual silence. Not numb, sharp, like the moment just before glass breaks. You're right, I said softly. Howard blinked. He hadn't expected me to agree. He never expected me to say anything at all. Absolutely right, I repeated. He smiled, the satisfied, slightly confused smile of a man who thought he'd won something. But I was already somewhere else entirely. Because for the first time in many years, I wasn't trying to smooth things over or protect anyone's feelings at the table. I was simply deciding something. I just hadn't told anyone yet. People always assume a marriage breaks apart in a single dramatic moment. A screaming match, a door slamming hard enough to shake the walls. But looking back now, I think mine dissolved the way Georgian Bay fog dissolves in the early morning. Slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you can no longer see anything that used to feel familiar. I met Howard Drummond when I was 29, and he was 32. I was teaching grade 2 at Eastview Public School in Guelph, Ontario, and he had just joined a civil engineering firm downtown. He was tall and methodical and steady in the way that felt safe to someone who had grown up in a chaotic house. He remembered small things, the name of my favorite bookshop on Wyndham Street, how I took my coffee, the title of a novel I mentioned once in passing and never expected him to track down. We married 18 months after we met. For a while, life was genuinely good. We bought a narrow Victorian row house on Willowgate Road. We had Spencer. We spent summers at Howard's family cottage on Georgian Bay, where the water was so cold it made you gasp and so clear you could see straight to the bottom. Then Howard's mother Lillian was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and everything shifted. It was Howard who suggested I take a leave from teaching. Just until we figure out the right arrangement, he said. Lillian lived 40 minutes away in Fergus, and the driving back and forth was hard. A full-time care facility would cost more than we could manage comfortably. It made sense for me to be home, to be available. It was temporary. He said it was temporary. I took the leave. I became Lillian's primary caregiver for 8 years. I drove her to appointments in Guelph and Kitchener. I managed her medications and her meals and her moods, which changed unpredictably as the disease progressed. I learned how to speak to her when words stopped working for her, how to keep her calm when she was frightened, how to hold her dignity intact on the days when her body refused to cooperate. It was the hardest work I had ever done, and it was invisible in a way that teaching never was. Teaching, at least, had witnesses. Howard thanked me in the early years. Then he stopped mentioning it altogether. Lillian passed away 10 years ago. Howard never suggested I go back to teaching. I didn't push it. By then, Spencer was in high school, and the house was its own full-time occupation. And somewhere in those years of caregiving, I had quietly lost my confidence in a way I couldn't have named at the time. I just stopped imagining myself in that classroom, stopped imagining myself anywhere that required me to be sure of something. Howard became the center of our household in the way that water becomes the center of a drain. Gradually, then completely. His schedule mattered most. His stress mattered most. His opinions on everything, from home repairs to what we ate for supper on Thursdays, became the ones we organized our lives around. And when he began questioning my small decisions, $50 on a winter scarf, a new set of pillowcases, a meal out with an old friend, I found myself apologizing automatically, without even understanding what I was apologizing for. That's the part I still wrestle with. Not what he did, what I let myself believe. The Wednesday night that ended our marriage didn't end it loudly. It ended it in me. In the small, cold, clear space that opened up while I was washing the dinner dishes, and Howard and Spencer had moved to the living room to watch television, as though the conversation at the table had been nothing more than weather talk. Celeste appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked uncomfortable. Not guilty, exactly, but caught in something she didn't know how to name. "He doesn't mean it badly," she said quietly. "He worries about you." I turned to look at her. She hesitated. "He says things sometimes, to Spencer, about how you'd struggle if you were ever on your own." I felt something tighten across my shoulders. "What kind of things?" Celeste looked toward the hallway. "That you're not practical. That you'd come back, if anything ever happened between the two of you." The plate in my hands was slippery from the dishwater. I held it more carefully. She shook her head. I shouldn't have said anything. But she had. And suddenly, certain things that had felt vaguely uncomfortable for years, the way neighbors looked at me with an excess of gentleness, the careful way people chose their words around me at Howard's firm dinners, all of it rearranged itself into something I could finally see clearly. Howard hadn't just been dismissive at home. He had been building a story about me, a helpless wife, a dependent woman, someone who required managing. I finished the dishes. I thanked Celeste for coming. I said goodnight to Spencer and Howard as though everything were ordinary. That night I didn't sleep. I lay beside Howard and listened to him, breathed and thought about 6 years in the way you think about a photograph that has been slowly overexposed. You know the image was there once, but it is harder and harder to make out the original shape of it. At 3 in the morning, I went downstairs and stood in the kitchen with the lights off for a long time. Then, I opened the drawer beside the back door, the one where Howard kept household files, and I found something that had been sitting there without my knowing it. A bank statement, account held in Howard's name only, mailing address, a post office box on Wyndham Street. The balance was $182,000. I stood in the dark kitchen for a very long time. I didn't confront him. Not immediately. I had spent enough years in that house to understand something about Howard's reaction to being cornered. He became cold, then methodical, then expertly reasonable in a way that made me feel like the unreasonable one. I wasn't going to walk into that. Instead, I began paying attention, the way you pay attention when you finally admit to yourself that something is wrong. 3 weeks later, while Howard was at his Thursday golf game, I found the file folder in his office cabinet, behind a box of old receipts, under a folder labeled Missy. Inside were transfer records, and a document I had to read twice before I understood it. The Georgian Bay cottage. The one Howard's parents had built in the 1970s and left to us jointly when Lillian died. I had signed paperwork connected to it several years ago, or so Howard told me. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand while he explained something quickly about updating the property title. Apparently, the cottage had been sold 14 months earlier. The proceeds, just over $93,000, had been transferred directly into the private account. I sat on Howard's office floor for 20 minutes, not crying, just understanding. The following Monday, I drove to a law office on Gordon Street and sat across from a family lawyer named Beatrix Nguyen, who had silver-streaked hair pulled back efficiently and eyes that did not miss anything. When I handed her the bank statement and the property records, she went very quiet in a focused way. "How long have you been married?" she asked. 26 years. "And you were unaware of this account?" "Completely." Beatrix set down the documents carefully. "Cecily, I want you to understand something clearly." She folded her hands on the desk. "Being a full-time caregiver and homemaker for 2 decades does not leave you without legal standing. Not in Ontario. Courts recognize that contribution." I stared at her. No one had said anything like that to me in years. Over the following 3 weeks, I became someone Howard had never imagined. I photographed documents in the early mornings before he was up. I went through files methodically, carefully, the way I used to prepare lesson plans, and organized, patient, thorough. I copied everything that mattered. Howard barely noticed the change in me, because he had spent so many years not noticing me at all. One evening he looked up from his laptop. "You've been quiet." "Tired," I said. He nodded, satisfied. "You should take a few days. Go visit your sister." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about where he thought I was. Nowhere that mattered. But there was something else I found during those weeks. Something I wasn't looking for. I had gone up to the spare room to find winter storage boxes and pulled out a carton I hadn't opened since we moved from the old house on Crimea Street 15 years ago. Inside, beneath a layer of bubble wrap, was a shoebox I recognized immediately. Green lid, slight water stain on one corner. I'd carried it through every move since my first apartment. Inside were letters, nearly 40 of them, some on lined paper torn from notebooks, some on the small notepaper that children's parents buy for school, some barely legible, all from former students. "Dear Mrs. Drummond, I learned to read because of you. You always knew when I was sad without asking. I still read every night before bed. I'm in grade 8 now." And at the bottom of the box, a card from my principal at Eastview, a man named Douglas Ferris, who had retired years ago and passed away not long after. His handwriting was careful and old-fashioned. "Cecily, in 20 years I have not seen a teacher with more patience or more genuine love for these children. Whoever is lucky enough to have you in their lives is better for it." I sat on the spare room floor with that card in my hands for a very long time. I had forgotten entirely that this version of me had existed. Her name was Deirdre Okafor, and I had not spoken to her in nearly 7 years, not because of any falling out. Simply because Howard had a way of making time spent with my old friends feel like an imposition on the household. Small sighs. Pointed comments about how late I'd come home. Eventually, I stopped making plans that required defending. Deirdre had been a colleague at Eastview, then she'd moved on to work in adult literacy. I knew from occasional glimpses on social media that she now ran a small community program out of a church hall on Paisley Road, teaching reading and basic skills to adult newcomers to Canada. I called her on a Thursday afternoon while Howard was at a client lunch. She answered on the second ring. "Cecily Drummond. I was just thinking about you last week." Something about hearing my own name said warmly, nearly undid me completely. We talked for an hour, at first about safe things, her children, the weather, the neighborhood. Then I told her, "Not everything. Enough." Deirdre was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come see the program. Come this Saturday." I'm not sure what I could offer. "You were the best classroom teacher I ever shared a hallway with," she said without hesitation. "Come Saturday." I went. The church hall on Paisley Road was smaller than I expected, with plastic chairs in careful rows and a whiteboard at one end that leaned slightly to the left. There were 11 students the morning I arrived. Adults ranging from their 20s to their 70s, most of them newcomers navigating English as a second or third language. Some were working on reading, some on writing. All of them were working harder than most people I knew worked at anything. Deirdre introduced me simply. "This is Cecily. She's going to help out today." I sat beside a woman named Amara, who had been in Canada for 8 months and was learning to read English at the age of 54. She apologized for being slow. I told her I'd once had a student who took all year to learn to hold a pencil correctly, and in grade 4, he won a writing competition. Amara laughed. It was the most genuine sound I'd heard in months. When I left that afternoon, something was different inside me. Not fixed, not healed, but awake. Howard found out 3 weeks later when Spencer mentioned it over the phone. He waited until Spencer had hung up before saying anything. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway where I was making tea, and he crossed his arms. "Sitting in a church basement teaching people to read," he said. It wasn't a question. "Volunteering," I said. "Yes." He made a sound. The particular sound he made when he considered something beneath commentary but chose to comment anyway. "Cecily, you're 62 years old." I know how old I am. This is Deirdre's charity project, not a career. I know what it is. He stepped further into the kitchen. "You know what this looks like. To people." I turned around slowly. "What people?" Howard paused, slightly thrown. "People we know. From the firm, my colleagues." I looked at him carefully. For the first time in years, I truly looked. Not at the man I'd married 30 years ago. At the man who had built an entire hidden financial life while I was washing his mother's hair and driving her to physiotherapy appointments in Kitchener. At the man who had been telling our son, quietly, persistently, that I could not survive without him. "You sound worried," I said. He stiffened. "I'm not worried about anything." I turned back to my tea. "I'm going on Tuesday as well." He left the kitchen without answering. That, I had learned, was its own kind of answer. The community center meeting happened 6 weeks after I began volunteering. It was a quarterly gathering. Local residents, a few city councilors, community groups presenting updates on neighborhood initiatives. Deirdre had asked me to speak briefly about the literacy program, about what it offered and what it still needed. I had not spoken publicly in years. Standing at that podium with 30 people in front of me, I felt the specific fear of someone who has been quiet for so long they've forgotten the sound of their own voice carrying across a room. But I started talking. About Amara. About a man named Vikram who had memorized bus routes by sound for 2 years before learning to read the signs. About what it costs a person, quietly and daily, to navigate a world made of words they cannot yet access. I don't know when Howard came in. I hadn't known he was planning to attend. I saw him near the back of the room when I was nearly finished, standing with his arms crossed, wearing the expression I recognized. Not pride, appraisal. Afterward, while people moved toward the refreshment table, and several community members stopped to speak with me, Howard approached. He waited until the group around me had thinned, then stepped in close. "That was fine," he said quietly, "but let's not make this a whole thing." "A whole thing," I repeated. "You know what I mean." He glanced around. "You standing up at a podium talking about illiteracy. It's not a professional context." "I'm not a professional," I said. "You've told me that." His jaw tightened. "Don't be difficult." A woman standing nearby turned slightly. Howard lowered his voice. "You want to feel useful, fine. But you don't have real qualifications for this. You haven't been in a classroom in 30 years. You should be honest with yourself about what you actually bring to this." "What I actually bring," I repeated. He smiled in the way he smiled when he thought he was being patient. "I just don't want you to embarrass yourself." The woman nearby was no longer pretending not to listen. She was looking directly at Howard. "I'm going to get some tea," I said. I walked away from him calmly, which seemed to confuse him more than any argument could have. I didn't know until 2 days later that the woman had recorded part of it on her phone. She messaged me through the community center's Facebook page. She said she'd posted it because she wanted people to see how I'd handled myself. She used the word dignity. The comments underneath said things I wasn't prepared to read. She kept her composure while he tried to take it from her. I know this woman. She's been teaching at that program for weeks. She's remarkable. That man is embarrassing himself, not her. Where do I donate to this literacy program? By the end of that week, the program's small donation page had received over $4,000. Deirdre called me on a Friday morning, laughing and crying at the same time. The divorce process moved more quickly once Beatrix Nguyen had the full picture of Howard's hidden accounts and the unauthorized cottage sale. Howard's manner changed overnight. The smug certainty evaporated, and in its place came something colder, more tactical. He hired an expensive lawyer and began talking about the complexity of long-term asset division. What he had not anticipated was that I had spent 26 years paying close attention to things he assumed I didn't understand. Spencer came to see me at the apartment I'd moved into on Henry Street, a 2-bedroom above a bookbinder's shop, with tall windows and radiators that clanged at midnight and a view of the park across the street. He sat at my small kitchen table, looking like a man who had recently had to revise something important. "Mum," he said, it came out quietly. He looked around the apartment, not judgmentally, carefully, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. "It's nice," he said finally. "It feels like you." That surprised me into silence for a moment. He rubbed his hands together. "Celeste found some emails on Dad's work account. He forgot she has admin access for his calendar." Spencer's voice dropped. "There's a woman from the firm. The emails go back almost 4 years." "I looked at the table," I said. He stared at me. "You knew?" "I didn't want to know," I said. "There's a difference." We sat quietly for a while. Then Spencer said, "I used to think he was strong. The way he just knew things, made decisions, never seemed uncertain." "I know. But I think he needed us to need him." His voice was careful. "I think that's different from strength." That sentence stayed with me for a long time, because I had spent 8 years making Lillian feel safe. Spencer had spent 36 years watching his father make the people around him feel small. The distance between those two things was the whole distance between love and control. Yolanda Strachan contacted me through the community center 6 weeks after the video circulated. She was the founder of the Wellington Women's Foundation. Not large, not famous, but quietly purposeful in the way that good work often is. She'd heard about the literacy program and wanted to meet. We sat in a coffee shop on Wyndham Street on a cold Tuesday morning. She ordered Earl Grey and asked me 3 questions about the program before she touched her cup. Then she said, "You're thinking too small." I laughed. "I'm thinking about keeping the lights on." Yolanda smiled. "The Provincial Literacy Grant has a new funding stream, community-based wraparound programs for newcomer adults. Your program fits the criteria almost exactly. What you need is someone to help you write the application." "I've never written a grant application in my life." "You taught children to read for 11 years, she said. "That's the hardest communication problem there is. The writing is the easy part." I want to be careful not to make Yolanda sound like magic, because she wasn't. She was a busy woman who believed in specific things and put her attention toward them deliberately. What she gave me wasn't rescue. It was the same thing Deirdre had given me earlier, an honest witness who looked at what I was actually doing and said, "Yes, that's real." Howard came to the program office one afternoon in February. It was a cramped room behind the main hall. A folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a shelf of donated books that leaned against the wall like tired friends. He stood in the doorway in his good coat and looked around with an expression I'd seen him use at other people's inadequate homes. "I need to talk to you," he said. Deirdre was in the main hall. I was alone. "Come in," I said. I didn't stand up. He sat across from me. He looked tired in a way that his particular vanity made hard to accommodate. Like a man who'd been sleeping badly but refused to admit it. "The situation with the firm is complicated," he said. "I know. There are going to be some findings about the account transfers that I want you to understand in context before." "Howard," I said his name plainly, not coldly, just directly. "Beatrix has everything. Whatever you're about to explain, she already has the documents." He went quiet. "What did you actually come here for?" I asked. He looked around the small office. "I came because I wanted to see what you'd built here. I let that sit for a moment. You used to tell Spencer I couldn't manage on my own, I said. I know. For years. He said nothing. I think you needed to believe it, I said. Because if I couldn't manage, I'd stay. And if I stayed, you didn't have to look at yourself too carefully. Howard's expression shifted. Something behind it that I hadn't let myself look at before. Something closer to grief than anger. I did love you, he said, quietly. I think you did, I said, in the way you understood love. He looked at me. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, I said, it's just the truth. We sat in that small office with a shelf of donated books between us and 26 years of something real and something broken. And I understood that I did not need him to be monstrous for my choices to be right. He was not a monster. He was a man who had learned somewhere along the way that the people closest to him were safest when they needed him, and he had arranged everything, the finances, the narrative, the careful architecture of our shared life, to make sure that remained true. He stood to leave. At the door he paused. Will you be all right? He asked. It sounded genuine. Yes, I said, I will. He nodded slowly. Then he walked out into the cold February afternoon, and I watched him through the window as he got into his car, and I felt something shift loose in my chest. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but something that felt like the quiet after a very long noise finally stops. The provincial grant came through that April. $47,000 over 2 years, enough to hire a part-time coordinator, expand to 2 evenings a week, and buy proper materials. The local paper ran a small story. A community radio station asked Deirdre and me to come in for an interview. I sat in that studio with a microphone in front of me, and the host asked what I wanted people to know about the program. I thought about Amara, who had recently read her daughter a bedtime story for the first time at the age of 54, and called me afterward unable to speak for several minutes. I thought about Vikram, who had been turned down for a promotion 3 times because he couldn't complete the written portion of the test, and who had just passed it on his 4th attempt. I thought about all the women I'd met through this work who were rebuilding themselves quietly and without ceremony in church halls and community centers across this country. I want people to know, I said carefully, that it is never too late to be useful, and that useful and invisible are not the same thing. A lot of us spend years being both at once without realizing we're allowed to choose. The host looked at me for a moment. Is that from experience? Everything is, I said. Howard and I met once more. In March, at a park near the Speed River, a place Spencer used to play as a child where Howard and I had walked many times in the early years of our marriage when we still reached for each other's hands without thinking about it. He sat on a bench near the water. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just smaller. Like a room after the furniture has been moved out. You seem well, he said when I sat down. I am well. He was quiet for a while. The river moved steadily past. A pair of geese made their way along the far bank. I spent a lot of years being afraid, he said, not apologetically. Just truthfully, the way people tell the truth when they've finally run out of reasons not to. Of being ordinary, of not being necessary. He looked at the water. I made myself necessary to you by making sure you didn't believe you could do without me. I nodded slowly. I know. I'm sorry, Cecily. I believe you, I said. Which is different from it being enough. Some apologies arrive too late to repair what they're answering. But they still matter. They are still their own kind of truth. We sat there a while longer. The way 2 people sit together when there is nothing more that needs to be said, but neither one is quite ready to leave the place where they once belonged to each other. Then I stood up and said goodbye and walked back along the path toward the car park and the city and the small office with the mismatched chairs and the shelf of donated books, where tomorrow morning Amara would come in early to practice before class, and Vikram would bring tea for everyone. And I would sit across from a room full of people learning to navigate the world on their own terms. I was 62 years old. I had spent 8 years caring for a woman who was not my mother, 26 years inside a marriage that made me smaller with each passing year, and decades being told. By Howard and eventually by myself, that I had nothing real left to offer. What I know now is this. The woman who walked out of that house on Willowgate Road with 2 suitcases and a shoebox full of old letters was not starting over. She was arriving at a life she had earned in the longest, most invisible way possible. Through years of showing up, paying attention, and refusing, finally, to believe that care only counts when someone else decides to count it. Howard said I'd never survive without him. What he never considered was that I had already been surviving for years. I had simply been doing it for everyone except myself. That was the thing I changed, and it turned out to be enough.